Active rooks. The single most important idea in rook endgames is this. An active rook is worth more than a passive one, sometimes significantly more. There are positions where a player is up a full pawn, but their rook is stuck defending something in the corner, while the opponent's rook is flying around the board creating threats everywhere. And the player with the passive rook loses anyway despite the extra pawn. Why? Because a passive rook typically has one role, or one pawn that it defends, and that's it. An active rook, on the other hand, it can give your opponent several headaches at once. This is the opposite of how most people think about endgames. In the middle game, you're used to protecting your pieces, keeping them safe, not letting them get captured. In the endgame, your rook needs to be aggressive, on open files, creating problems, not sitting around waiting to be told what to do. The practical rule is simple. Your rook belongs on an open file. If there's no open file, create one. If you can't create one yet, at least make sure your rook isn't stuck behind your own pawns doing nothing. A rook that can't see the board might as well not exist. So in this position, black's rook on d8 is very passive, simply defending one pawn, while your rook on e6 is very active, putting pressure on two of black's pawns and having control of the whole board, allowing your king to devour all of black's pawns while he's forced to keep his rook and king stuck in the corner. But what if you took the concept of an active rook and took it to the extreme? You would get 7th rank. If there's one square on the board your rook is always dreaming about landing on in the endgame, it's the 7th rank. White's rook on the 7th rank, black's rook on the 2nd rank. Same idea, just from opposite sides. From the 7th rank, your rook attacks all of your opponent's pawns that haven't moved from their starting squares. It restricts their king to the back rank, cutting off its ability to participate in the game. It creates mating threats, and overall it applies pressure in every direction simultaneously. A rook on the 7th rank is doing 5 jobs at once, and your opponent will have a nightmare dealing with all of the threats. Getting your rook to the 7th rank is often worth more than winning a pawn, because from the 7th rank you'll win multiple pawns anyway. The technique is usually to find a moment when your opponent's back rank is weak, often right as you're entering the endgame, and slide the rook in before they can organize a defense or prevent it from getting to the 7th rank in the first place. Here, after your rook lands on d7, it has arrived on its dream square. It now controls black's entire 7th rank, simultaneously putting pressure on every single pawn at once and forcing black's rook into an awkward and passive position. The best part is, black's king is stuck too. If he tries to push your rook away, you just simply move it away to c7, and if he overcommits with the king, the c7 pawn will hang, making this position really difficult to navigate for black. Your plan, on the other hand, is simple, and in order to understand it better, let's take a look at king activity. Here's something most players at the club level genuinely don't do. Use their king in the endgame. In the middle game, you castle, you tuck your king away, you keep it safe. That is the right mentality. But as soon as the queens get traded off and the position transitions into an endgame, it's very important that you realize that your king is a very powerful piece in the endgame. It can attack pawns, defend pawns, support your own passed pawn, and get in the opponent's way. A centralized king in the endgame is often worth a pawn by itself in terms of what it can accomplish. The rule is simple. Once the position simplifies and there are no major threats to your king's safety, start marching it toward the center, toward the action, toward wherever the critical pawns are. Every tempo your king spends sitting on the back rank doing nothing is a tempo wasted. For example, in this position, who do you think is winning? If you said white, you are correct. And the reason is very simple. Yes, white's rook is definitely way more active than black's rook, but there's an even more important factor in this position. It's white's king. The king is all the way up towards the center of the board, and it's ready to march towards black's weak pawns on the queen side and support the rook in converting this winning endgame. But what if the king were on g1 instead? Well, now the position is actually a draw. Why? Because now both white and black have very passive kings, and even though white has an extremely active rook, it doesn't have the support required to actually maximize its potential. Now, as much as activating your own king is extremely important, this next tip goes hand in hand with this. And I'm of course talking about cutting off the enemy king. As we just discussed, the king is a fighting piece, meaning when both players know what they're doing, both kings are trying to get active, trying to support their own pawns, trying to attack the opponent's pawns, trying to participate in what's happening on the board. Your rook's job is to stop that from happening on their side. Cutting off the king means placing your rook on a rank or file that the opponent's king cannot cross. If their king wants to go left, you put your rook on the d or e file and suddenly their king is stuck on the king side forever. If their king wants to go forward, you put your rook on the 4th rank and it's cut off to the back half of the board. A king that's cut off can't help. It can't defend its own pawns. It can't stop your passed pawn from advancing. It just watches while you do whatever you want on the other side of the board. And a king that's been cut off by even 1 or 2 files is completely neutralized. It doesn't take much. This is one of the most underused techniques at the under 2000 level. Players activate their rook, activate their own king. They do all the right things, but they just don't utilize their rook to keep the enemy king out of the game. This is one of those concepts that can really change the way you play these endgames, especially if up to this point, everything has seemed like common sense. The moment that king gets through, everything gets complicated. Keep it out. Here, black plays king d7, hoping to get the king in front of the pawn and barricade it, which would result the game in a draw. But here you have only one move that saves your winning chances. Can you find it? The move is rook e1, cutting off black's king before it's able to get into the box. Now, no matter what black tries, your pawn will eventually promote, and the only way to stop it is to give up the rook for it. And hopefully by now, every single Chess Explained viewer knows how to checkmate with a king and rook. But there's one final concept we haven't covered yet, and it's arguably the most important one out there. I'm talking about Tarrasch's rule. The rule is simple. If you have a passed pawn, your rook belongs behind it, pushing it forward. From behind the pawn, your rook gains power as the pawn advances. Every square the pawn moves forward gives your rook more room to operate, more files to control, more pressure to apply. The rook and the pawn work together as a unit, and the further the pawn goes, the stronger the unit becomes. And your opponent will either have to use their own rook or their king to barricade the pawn and prevent it from promoting, meaning they have to create a passive piece just to stay in the game. And this is why passed pawns are so valuable in rook endgames. If your opponent has a passed pawn, your rook belongs behind that. Your king should stay active, and if eventually your opponent happens to move their rook, that's when you grab their passing pawn and try to get your rook back in the game. A rook in front of a passed pawn is defending it. A rook behind a passed pawn is restraining it. The difference is enormous. The one situation where you might deviate from this is when your rook can do something even more valuable elsewhere, like cutting off the enemy king. But as a default, when in doubt, get behind the passed pawn. In this position, even though white is down a whole 3 pawns, they are still winning this game. That's the power of passing pawns. And once you get it to the 7th rank, black's rook is essentially glued to that one square. If it tries moving, you simply promote, and black has to give up their rook. And in this position, you're actually able to get your king all the way up to b6, where it defends the pawn, meaning your rook is actually free to do whatever it wants. And black simply has no way of stopping you. If they move their king, your own king can move up to b7, at which point black has to sacrifice their rook, meaning you end up in a winning position. Now here's the thing about rook endgames. We've covered most of the main concepts, but honestly these positions are some of the most complex and nuanced in all of chess. The exact techniques for converting specific endgames into a win is the kind of material that genuinely takes time and practice to absorb, and a single video can only go so far. That's actually why I want to talk about today's sponsor, Chessmate Academy. It's run by Diva Makwana, a FIDE-rated coach who's represented India internationally and sits at 2,500 plus ELO on both Lichess and chess.com. If you're the kind of player who watches videos like this and thinks, okay, but how do I actually remember all of this? That's exactly the gap coaching closes that a video alone can't. Chessmate offers a completely free 45-minute assessment. You bring one of your own recent games and Divam breaks down what's actually holding your rating back and where to focus, with no pressure and no obligation to continue afterward. And if you do want to keep going, plans start at $100 per month, which includes 4 personalized one-on-one coaching sessions, plus access to a custom-built training platform with personalized assignments to reinforce what you covered. If you want to book your free 45-minute one-on-one chess assessment, click the link in the description and book your assessment now. Again, the assessment itself is completely free, and if you're serious about getting better at chess, I would highly recommend it. Alright, back to the endgames. There are 2 positions that come up over and over again in rook endgames, and if you know both of them, you can handle the vast majority of rook and pawn versus rook situations correctly without calculating anything. They're called the Lucena and the Philidor, and they're basically the 2 fundamental blueprints for this endgame type. One shows you how to win, and one shows you how to draw. Let's first take a look at the Lucena. The Lucena position is the winning blueprint. It arises when your extra pawn has advanced all the way to the 7th rank, your king has moved in front of it, and the only problem is that the opposing rook keeps checking your king from behind, preventing it from escaping. The technique is called building a bridge. First, give a check. Black has to move away from the pawn. If they move to e6 here, you simply go king e8, and your pawn will promote on the next move. After black's king moves away, you maneuver your own rook to the 4th rank. And here's what that actually does. Let's go back to that initial position for a second. Black could technically give you checks infinitely, and if your king comes too far back, black will be able to take your pawn. But now let's put that rook on f4. You go king e7, getting ready to promote, check, king d3, another check. Here, you have to go to move to e6 to keep the pawn defended, and after rook e2 check, you now go king d3, and if black goes for yet another check, your rook swings over and blocks the check. Now, whatever black plays, promotion is inevitable. This sounds simple, but it's surprisingly easy to miss over the board if you've never seen it before. Once you have, it's one of those patterns your brain just recognizes instantly, even if it isn't this exact position, one for one. The other key position you should know is the Philidor. The Philidor position is the drawing blueprint, what you do when you're the side without the extra pawn and you need to survive. Your mission is simple: get the rook to the 6th rank. Once it's here, white literally cannot make progress. And you might think, in this position, can't white just push the pawn forward and completely trap your king? They can push the pawn, but as soon as that happens, you switch gears completely. You abandon the 6th rank and start checking the enemy king from behind instead. Now, it's a dead draw, and the attacking king can never find shelter because your rook just keeps checking. These two positions are not just theoretical curiosities, they're the endgame knowledge that separates players who know how to convert a win from players who let it slip away. If you walk away from this video knowing nothing else, know these two, and now let's cover the actual reasons beginners tend to lose their rook endgames. Common mistakes. The absolute #1 mistake beginners make all of the time is trading rooks way too early when you're winning. If you're up a pawn in a rook endgame, the rook staying on the board usually helps you. You have more ways to create pressure and more chances to convert. Trading into a pure king and pawn endgame can be fine if you've calculated it correctly, but a lot of players do it by reflex rather than by calculation and end up in a drawn position they thought was winning. Check before you trade. The second mistake is pushing your pawns too fast. This feels right. Say you have a passed pawn that you want to promote it. You do the logical thing and push it. But often the correct move is to improve your rook position or your king position first, and only then push the pawn when everything is coordinated. Rushing the pawn before your pieces are ready gives the defending side time to either set up the Philidor or more commonly just bring their king across and to the center. Coordinate first, push second, and last but not least, letting your rook become passive. This comes up constantly. You make a trade, the position simplifies, and your rook ends up on a square where it's just defending one of your own pawns and doing nothing else. The moment you notice your rook is passive, that should trigger a question. How do I get this thing active again? Even if it costs a tempo, an active rook is almost always worth the price. Or better yet, don't allow a rook to become passive in the first place. Avoid it at all costs. If this helped, subscribe. Let me know which tip you found the most helpful down below.